Whether you call it Kveik, Kvik, or Kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. Hey everybody, we've made it to the 280th episode of the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor and host of the Brü Lab podcast, Cade Jobe, to answer a bunch of questions submitted by listeners of the show, something we do every 10th episode.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back. I love answering listener questions, and to be honest, this one's going to throw me for a loop a little bit. There's a couple of these questions that not only did I not have a good answer, but I struggle with a couple of these myself, so that's going to be a fun one whenever we get to those.
Yeah, I feel like I say it every time we do a Brü A episode, which is like 27 times now, but I love spending time answering the questions just like you do, Cade. Not only because these episodes require a little bit less effort to plan as well, but because a lot of the questions we get really do make me think. And going through these questions, I try not to overthink them because I want my responses to be, organic or whatever. Some of these questions kind of spun me for a loop as well. I had to think a little bit differently, and I appreciate having to do that. So, well, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month's guest is master mead maker and owner of New Hampshire's Moonlight Meadery, the highly renowned Michael Fairbrother. While I don't have the easiest access to Moonlight Mead where I live here in Fresno, I've been lucky enough to try a handful of their products, and I'm telling you, these meads are incredible. What Michael and his team are doing at Moonlight is just awesome, and we're fortunate to have him as the live Q&A guest for April of 2023. If you want to be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brülosophy by Friday, April 28th, 2023, as Michael's going to be taking questions on Saturday, the 29th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brülosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. Finally, if you wouldn't mind, please take a few seconds to leave a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts. I actually just learned that Spotify recently rolled out some interesting new functions. You can ask questions about episodes, and apparently we're able to respond to those. I don't know, but go check it out if that's your platform of choice. And otherwise, if you could just leave us a rating and review, we'd really appreciate that. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run a really great YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear or even just reasonably priced kettles and other brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know that Brülosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Steve Lane from Southern Australia wrote in with some thoughts after listening to episode 276, where we talked about the differences between whole cone and pellet hops. Steve says, "What a timely episode. I primarily use pellet hops, but it's harvest time here in Southern Australia, so I'll have my own hops to use in a batch soon. Not having a production line to turn the buds into pellets means I'll have to use the whole cones in beer. It's nice to know there doesn't seem to be a perceptible difference."
Yeah, this is cool. Anytime I see this about like whole cones versus pellets, it's really, really interesting to me. And that was a really great episode. I mean, you guys did an awesome job on that one. And really cool that you're going to be growing your own hops. I mean, it's like the winter here in the United States, so it's like crazy for me to think about people harvesting hops. But of course, right? Australia and New Zealand have got their hops harvest going on right now. So that's really cool. And whole cones versus pellets. I mean, I think there's some interesting stuff about like aging and how, the storage of those. But certainly using them in the beer, that's really fun. And hey, you get to do a fresh hop ale if you want to as well. So that'd be a fun thing too.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking is if you're harvesting your own hops, if you're going to use standard whole cone, you're going to have to dry those hops and go through that whole process, or you can just brew fresh hop beers, which are delicious. So, and Steve, just a heads up, I tend to shy away from extrapolating too much from our experiment results. We say that all the time, at least publicly. We try not to, I guess, speak in terms of certainty about certain, experiment findings. But I will just say that I do, probably brewers choose whatever works best for their system. And I think that's a good sign that both whole cone and pellets work basically the same. So again, I'm not saying that absolutely that they're identical, but our experiments, my experiences, and the anecdotal reports of so many other brewers seems to suggest that, yeah, you can get away with using whole cone hops, pellet hops, and likely get, indistinguishable beers using either of those. So personally, I feel that pellet hops are just far easier to use and store, and so that's why I prefer them. But if I had whole cone hops, I'd use those as well. So thank you for hitting us up, Steve. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. When we return from this break, answers to your questions. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brulosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to exchillerator.com today. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Massive cheers to all the fine folks who sent in their questions. The list is pretty long, so if we don't get to a question that you emailed, chances are we will in a future Brü A episode. All right, first up, a question comes from Dennis Foss, who says, I've been brewing for 12 years but can no longer tolerate alcohol due to gastritis. I'd like to make low alcohol beer, around 0.5 to 2% max, and was reading various ways to achieve this, including letting the grains sit in cold water overnight. This would be possible, but not ideal since it's a lot of extra work. I was wondering if I could simply mash in at 178 Fahrenheit, I don't know exactly what that is in Celsius, and not have the grain convert to sugar. Any suggestions? Have you any experience with making ultra-low alcohol beer? Diluting is possible, but obviously loses a ton of flavor.
Yeah, so 178 Fahrenheit's around 80 Celsius, just a little bit shy of 80 degrees Celsius. And I have some experience on this topic, Dennis. We just published an experiment. I don't know, it's been a couple months at this point, but that whole experiment was a non-alcoholic beer mash method experiment, right? So I did one batch that was fermented at a high mash temperature, so it was 180 F or around 80 Celsius, and for 1 hour versus a cold soak. So that was just at room temperature for 1 hour. I didn't soak the grains overnight on the cold soak, but it was just like 1 hour in each of those. And it came back significant. They both made different beers, but they were good. I mean, they were, well, there were non-alcoholic beers, so they weren't as good as like other beers that I've brewed before. And this was my first attempt at a non-alcoholic beer, but they were certainly passable and certainly drinkable. So yes, you can absolutely mash in at 178 Fahrenheit, or just shy of 80 Celsius, and make a non-fermentable wort. I actually really liked that method more than the cold soaking. Again, I only cold soaked for 1 hour, but the cold soak one was way lighter and way thinner. which is something that I think is a big problem with non-alcoholic beers.
Yeah.
Some of them just taste watery and thin, and that's not something that I would want to do. If I did cold soak again, I would definitely increase the time, right? So maybe soaking overnight. But that high mash temp method, I thought was great, and I had great success with that. One other comment that I would say about non-alcoholic beers is you may want to invest in a good pH meter if you don't have one. I think it's super important in non-alcoholic beers because these beers, I didn't make any adjustments for pH, but it's an upcoming experiment I'm going to be pitching to the crew is adjusting the pH of non-alcoholic beers, because I think that's going to play a really big role in getting that nice rounded mouthfeel and that body that we're always looking for in beer. I think pH is going to play a big role in that. But anyway, those are just some thoughts that I had. Check out that experiment. And then also there's a write-up. If you look on brulosophy.com and search non-alcoholic brewing methods, there's a whole write-up about a bunch of different methods like arrested fermentation, filtration, reducing the grain bill, membrane filtration if you have access to that sort of equipment. But there's a whole write-up that we've done on there about a bunch of different ways to make non-alcoholic beers. And of course, there's a couple episodes on the Brew Lab podcast too. So check all that stuff out. And cool, if you explore non-alcoholic beers and you have some good success with it, I'd love to hear about it because it's certainly something I'm interested in too.
Yeah, you know my perspective of non-alcoholic beers, Cade. I'd rather drink water, but I will. Right? So I don't have anything to offer, Dennis, except for in theory, I know brewing, and in theory, mashing in at 80 C or 178 Fahrenheit. The idea there is that you're so far above, you've denatured the enzymes that would typically convert the starches into fermentable sugar, and so that you're not getting all of that sugar, but you're still ostensibly extracting the flavor from the malt. That's the idea, right, Cade?
Exactly, totally. Yeah, you're denaturing those enzymes, so you're not getting the fermentable sugars. You're getting the long-chain dextrins.
Right.
So you're still getting all of those body and mouthfeel flavor, but you are getting glucose and fructose because there's glucose and fructose just in the wort.
Yeah.
So that's it, but it's a super small amount, and that's all the fermentation you're getting, which is usually less than 0.5%.
And so that's why these non-alcoholic beers do still tend to have 0.5% or so of alcohols because of the glucose and fructose?
Yeah, exactly. And that gives it a little bit of fermentation character too, right? Because that's important to beer. There's other things that are in there, right? There's other secondary metabolites that are part of beer flavor, not just alcohol and sugar, right? So it gives just a little bit of fermentation character, which I think really nicely rounds out the beer.
So the only other comment that I have for Dennis then is has to do with his gastritis. I'm not obviously a medical doctor, so I don't know exactly what gastritis is or what causes it to flare up. But I would think that regardless of the level of alcohol, that it's the other stuff in beer that might cause it to flare up. At least that's my experience. I could have I don't have gastritis. I don't think I do at least, but I could have a 0.5% non-alcoholic beer that's made otherwise identically as a regular beer, and I'm still going to feel that, in my gut. So I don't know if that's the route you want to go, whatever. But I do appreciate the question, Dennis. And I think, as non-alcoholic brewing continues to grow, we're going to start, it's kind of like the Wild West of non-alcoholic beer brewing, I think, right now. And we're figuring out a lot of stuff. So these types of questions are what are going to spur more experimentation and ultimately better methods. So.
Yeah, exactly. And also play around with other additions, right? Fruit and that kind of stuff, adding that in the beer too. Because I think that's also a way that an avenue that hasn't been explored as much. But all right, so next question comes from Brulosophy patron Jeremy Hunter from the UK. Hey, Jeremy, what's up, man? And Jeremy says, I brewed a 15-liter, 5-gallon short and shoddy smash batch using crisp extra pale malt and Cascade hops, where I did a 30-minute mash and a 30-minute boil. It seemed fine, but 3 days into fermentation, I got a strong whiff of canned sweet corn. I haven't brewed that much, so I'm not the kind of person who thinks they know off flavors to look clever, but I understand this aroma is a result of DMS, which can occur if the precursors are not boiled off sufficiently. If that's the case, how do you avoid this with a short boil, or are there other contributing factors to eliminate?
First off, that smash sounds so good. Just pale
really
malt and
does.
Cascade.
Yeah.
The thing is, Jeremy, if you're getting canned sweet corn and that's what you are convinced you're smelling, then yeah, the signs point to DMS. A 30-minute boil is going to drive off all of the SMM and the DMS precursor, and any DMS that's converted, that's going to drive off in 30 minutes. At least that's been our experience. I have done so many 30-minute boils. I mean, that is one of the things in the short and shoddy method that I don't even feel is that shoddy anymore. So many people are doing these reduced boils nowadays and not getting DMS. So it causes me to question whether it was the reduced boil or if perhaps there's something else causing that DMS there, like a contamination. And if you started to notice it kind of after a little bit, it's fermenting, it's doing this thing, and then you've packaged the beer and you start drinking it, and then that's when you start to notice it. It's that, to me, seems like it's probably indicative of some form of a contamination, or perhaps you're just smelling something else. I've never used crisp extra pale malt, but different malts do have different characteristics. They're not all exactly the same. And so you might be detecting something unique, and, our brains tend to try to categorize that. Oh, that must be DMS because I never got this using raw pale malt or whatever. So I really don't know. I don't think, though, that after a 30-minute boil, you're going to have any noticeable DMS in that wort. So how do I avoid it? I've never had an issue with it. So that's I guess my answer to that question.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of things that are going on during fermentation, and that's I think that's what you're saying, Marshall, is there may be other things that it could be, right? It could be a spoilage organism. That certainly comes to mind. But then there's also DMSO, dimethyl sulfur oxide. And so that is actually a yeast thing. So yeast turns SMM precursor into DMSO, which can then be reduced back down to DMS. But that DMS is, remember, the DMS itself, it has that low boiling point, right? Is that right? Shoot, I can't remember. I can't remember if it's SMM or DMS that has that low thermal conversion point. But either way, so DMS may be off-gassing during fermentation. So you said here that you're just 3 days in, and one of my biggest questions then is, what did it taste like at the end?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what did it taste like 5 or 6 or 7 days, or whenever you kegged it or bottled it or whatever? Because that would be really indicative of whether it was DMS to me.
Yeah.
Because if it sticks around all the way through the end of packaging, then yeah, that may be DMS. It also could be a spoilage organism, something like that. But also, you're doing a 30-minute boil, increase it to 45 minutes if you want to, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And see if that makes a difference. There's a bunch of different ways that you can try to adjust your process to do that. The other thing, crisp extra pale malt. I've brewed with crisp extra pale malt before, and to me, I don't get a cooked corn character from it, but there's definitely this like sweet grainy flavor that I get from it. I call it sort of like a cereal character. It's not like Cheerios, which is an oat cereal that we have here, but it's like this sweet grainy character from crisp extra pale, and that could be DMS, or it could just also be the malt itself. So for troubleshooting, I'd say first of all, try a different yeast and see if that does something different, right? If that DMSO is a problem, try a different yeast, then try a different malt next time, see if that's something. And if neither of those things work, then try extending the boil to like 45 minutes and see if you get that same fermentation. If you get it through all of those, then I would be looking at like a spoilage organism, unfortunately.
Yeah. And, I don't mean to suggest that you like messed up your process or anything like that, Jeremy. It's so, we have tried so hard to make beers with noticeable levels of DMS in them. And even with lab testing, we're unable to do it. I mean, I've done a covered kettle that's not boiled vigorously. We've done 20-minute boils. We've done all of that, and it is so difficult. At least it has been for us to get noticeable levels of DMS. So if you're picking that up and it is actually DMS, I'm with you, Cade. You don't need to boil for 30 minutes. Just extend your boil, see if you're still getting it or whatever, and you should be good there. So. All right, next question comes from Dave Lackley. He says, I'm trying to minimize cold side oxidation exposure. Good for you, Dave. I ferment in SS Brewtech brew buckets and run a blow-off tube into a NorCal Brewing Solutions CO2 harvester to eliminate oxygen suckback during cold crash. Now, an aside real quick, these CO2 harvesters are like I believe there are 2 1-liter ball jars or mason jars that have, one of them has water in it, and the CO2 kind of bubbles in through that. And then you've got this one jar that's it's essentially full of CO2. But that way, when you're cold crashing, it doesn't suck oxygen and it sucks the CO2 back in. So, Dave says, when fermentation is done, I fill a keg with star sand and purge it with CO2. I run a line from the fermenter into the beverage outpost on the keg, then connect my blow-off tube to the gas post. When I open the valve on the fermenter, the beer flows into the keg, pushing the CO2 out and into the top of the fermenter. I know I'm not the first to do a version of this, quote, closed loop transfer, but I'm looking for advice to improve it. When I go to connect the blow-off tube to the keg, there's a period of time that the end of the tube is open, allowing some oxygen into the fermenter. I'm wondering if there's some kind of quick disconnect or other method to close the blow-off tube while I'm resituating it onto the keg.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first thing you can do is you can put a gas post on the brew bucket, right? There's a lot of people that have done that. So instead of the blow-off tube, just put a gas post on the top, and then use a quick disconnect on the top of it, and then you don't have to worry about it. I think my main comment from this is, I don't think I would worry about it too much.
That's where I'm at. Yeah.
I mean, I totally get it. Minimizing cold side oxygen exposure is a huge deal, but the disconnect right there where you're basically just disconnecting for a very short time, and then you're pushing, or not pushing, all of the beer is gravity transferring into the keg. I mean, any oxygen that's actually mixing in at the top of that beer, I'm not sure it's going to have that much of an effect on the long term, of your beer. Just because everything else you're doing is great, right? Like you're using the CO2 harvester, you're doing a closed loop transfer. You're not just racking into an unpurged un-CO2 keg. So you're doing a lot of great things. So I think my main feedback for this one would just be, I don't know that I'd worry about it too much.
You and I both, Cade. Your setup, Dave, is like leaps and bounds better than what so many people do already. The chances that you are actually exposing your beer to, just because of the end of that tube for that very little bit amount of time, the chances that oxygen's even making its way into your fermentation vessel during transfer is so slim. But even if it is, we've done experiments. We've done so many experiments looking at, the impact of not purging kegs or the impact of not minding cold side oxidation overall. And I remember when I first did the experiment, I believe it was on a hazy IPA, looking at cold side oxidation, and found that, holy cow, this whole oxidation thing is real. The beer tastes awful, or not nearly as good as the non-oxidized version. I just convinced myself at that point that it's every little step that I took mattered, right? So then we started breaking down those steps. And when we looked at pushing beer out of a fermentation vessel using CO2 versus allowing air to come in and do it, so like gravity versus what we call pressure transfers, there was no difference, which means that, oxygen might be coming in because it has to displace, right? As the beer's flowing out of your fermentation vessel, something else has to go in there, whether that's CO2 or oxygen. Well, I don't think it's mixing with the beer. And if you're like the majority of brewers out there, you're not taking 100% of that beer, the volume out of your fermentation vessel and putting it in your keg or your bottles. You're leaving a good half a gallon in the fermentation vessel. Well, ostensibly, that half a gallon is what was exposed to, the top of your beer is what was exposed to oxygen. It's not even making it into the package anyways. That is my explanation. My what I think is happening at the very least. All of that to say, I think that you've got a great setup, Dave. I wouldn't worry too much about it unless you're having issues with oxidation. If that starts to become an issue, then let's rethink things. But if your beers are great, you're not oxidizing your beer, then that's proof is in the pudding, right? You've got proof right there that your methods are working for you.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like if you wanted to make a change, go ahead and put a gas post on the brew bucket, and then you can purge the line with CO2, before you actually connect it for your closed loop transfer. That would be the way to just eliminate all oxygen. But like Marshall said, and like we've been saying, I think you're doing your leaps and bounds above where I was before I started paying attention to cold side oxidation. And I think you're doing a great job. Keep up that good work, Dave, and keep trying to improve the process. And if you find a way that's better than what we said, just let us know. All right, next question is from Brian S. Thomas from Cranberry Township, Pennsylvania, and he says, I was hoping Marshall would discuss his seltzer water process for draft. I've wanted to do this for my wife for years and can now that I've built a Keezer, but I have some questions. Are you treating the water? My wife and I tasted several bottled water brands and both liked a couple of brands that had mineral adjustments. Where's the flavor coming from? I ordered some of the bottles of flavoring that work with home seltzer makers. How is the carbonation? Still burst carbonating? I'm looking for a finer bubble, so I'm trying a lid with an attached carbonation stone. Any notes you have would be great.
So this whole thing about getting a finer bubble and all, I don't know how that works. So to me, the perceptive, or what you perceive as being that carbonation, the fineness of the bubble, or if they're big bubbles or whatever, I feel like that's more a function of the density of the liquid that you're trying to carbonate. But I don't know. Maybe there is something to using a carb stone. I've used them before. I hate cleaning those things, so I stopped using them, and I didn't notice any difference in the quality of the carbonation in my beer. I've never used one with seltzer water. I just wanted to comment that I don't know if there's anything you can do to change the quality of the carbonation, but maybe there is. Maybe I'm an idiot and somebody's figured something else out to get a really fine bubble in your seltzer water. I think more than anything, you want to carbonate it highly, and then that creates that experience of that fine bubble in your mouth. So that's what I do when I make seltzer water. Now, Brian, I feel like you're asking about non-alcoholic seltzer water. So that's how I'm going to respond to this. Not like hard seltzers, which I've only made one of those, and it was really just a cocktail. It was like a vodka soda in a keg, and that worked out really well, actually. So do I treat my water? I do not. I've done it a couple of times. My wife and I didn't notice any difference, and so now all I do is take carbon filtered water right out of my RV hose, so you don't want to use a gross hose for that. Fill up a keg, and then I attach 50 PSI. I have secondary regulators. They're expensive, but they're well worth the cost because you can regulate all of your kegs at different pressures, which is wonderful. I hit it with 50 PSI for about 18 hours. So it really does. I'm trying to carbonate this thing as quickly and as much as possible. And then I knock it down to 20 PSI and I let it sit there until that carbonation feels right. And I don't know if it's fineness or whatever. That usually takes 2 to 3 more days. And then I knock it down to serving, which is 14 PSI for, that's on my system. You'll do whatever works best for you for serving. And that seems to work. My kids drink the heck out of it. My wife loves it. We blow through kegs in like 2 weeks, and it's the easiest brew day ever because you're just filling a keg with water. Now, I did get my hands, the only time I've flavored them, I've used actual flavorings from, I'm not even sure what the company is, but my buddy, who is the head brewer over at Crow and Wolf, got a whole bunch of samples of these, tons of these samples of these flavors. They're not even extracts. They look like alcohol, little alcohol bottles, but I add about 9 to 10 milliliters per 5-gallon keg of this stuff just straight to the water, and then shake it up, seal the keg, shake it up just to make sure it's all integrated. And then I do that whole carbonation process, and it works incredibly well. It tastes better than, I've got a lime one on right now. It tastes better than LaCroix, in my opinion. My kids love it. And then it makes it really great for when I'm making gin cocktails. I like to have gin and soda water. I'm not a huge fan of tonic. So you drop you got some lime carbonated water off the keg, throw some gin in there, add a little bit of, fresh squeezed lime on there, and you got a great cocktail. So that's what I do. There's nothing else special about it. It's super easy, and it's awesome to have a keg of just carbonated water on tap. Like I said, Cade, I'd rather drink that than non-alcoholic beer. So,
well, I guess you do you and I'll do me, because I don't like carbonated water.
Come on! It's so popular these days,
no,
dude. You don't
disgusting.
like it.
Like, what's the point, right? Like, I'd rather just no, I don't need to add carbonation to my water. I'm just gonna drink water if I want water.
I love it.
No, I really don't get it. I don't like Topo Chico or LaCroix or any of those things. Whenever somebody offers, like at a restaurant, you go to the restaurant, they're like, "Would you like carbonated or still water?" I'm like, "No, give me the still water. I don't want any of that carbonated crap."
I love it.
No, but of course, to each their own. I've never made carbonated water, so I don't have anything to add on this. Other than that, think about the carbonation stone. That sort of like piqued my interest a little bit. I always thought carbonation stones were just diffusion, like not like bubble quality, but just just getting CO2 diffused into the solution, right? I mean, when we're doing burst carbonation, we're putting the CO2 on the top and relying on pressure to push the CO2 down into the liquid. And CO2 doesn't want to go in the liquid; it wants to come out. That's why it foams and bubbles, right? So you're like fighting against a natural process, and that's why it takes longer. A carbstone is just, it puts the CO2 directly in the liquid and it bubbles inside the liquid. So I thought it was just diffusion. Not finer bubbles, but who knows? I mean, I can learn something new. I mean, I had no idea about this like fine bubble quality, but anyway, that's a total digression. I don't like carbonated water.
And we still accept you, Cade. I don't like non-alcoholic beer. So, hey, we should have shirts made.
Exactly. That's totally right. We should have shirts made. Yeah. Yours says, I don't like non-alcoholic beer. And mine says, I don't like carbonated water.
That's like the I'm with stupid shirts where you're like, well, you're not with anybody. Okay.
Exactly.
Anyways, Brian, give it a go. Yeah. Give it a go. Try it out. I'm sure you and your wife will both appreciate it. My kids prefer sparkling water to soda, which was very intentional on our part, my wife's and my part. And so having a keg of it for them to go out and be able, they're also learning how to pour from a tap. So that's kind of convenient as well. So, all right. Next question. Our final one for this segment comes from David Scheel, who says, in a past Brü A episode, you guys mentioned something about hop oxidation that might cause hop burn. How long does it take to oxidize pellets? Instantaneous, minutes, hours? How about for beer? Any additional information will be appreciated.
Oh, holy moly. This is a great question.
It's also an entire episode.
Yeah, it's a whole episode. There's so many things. It depends on a bunch of stuff, like temperature, what temperature you're holding at. Is it in the freezer? Is it sitting out on your counter? Is it outside in a box, because it got shipped to you? What's the oxygen exposure? Are you purging any of the bags? Are you vacuum sealing? Are you just opening it up? Are you opening it up and leaving it outside versus like just letting it be nitrogen sealed outside? When was the hop harvested? All kinds of things. The hop variety itself matters too. I mean, Galaxy, we were talking about, we weren't talking about it yet, but on episode 22 of the Brü Lab with Simon Wittick, we were talking, that was from Hop Products Australia. We were talking about Galaxy as a notoriously unstable hop.
Yeah.
And he was actually suggesting that if you leave hops open on the counter at like normal room temperature for even 24 hours, you can totally destroy the hop. I'm not sure that that's going to cause hop burn, but it's going to make a gross hop. But the big takeaway here, and the big takeaway from that study, is that cold temperatures really do slow this whole oxidation process. It's not that it doesn't happen, because it does, but storing them cold in the freezer, hops can be stored there for a long time. I mean, this is totally Cade's anecdotal experience, but I've got hops from 2019 and 2020 that are still in my freezer that I still use, that still smell great.
Yep.
And they've been frozen up there for what? It's 2023 now. That's 4 years, since those hops have been harvested, and they still taste just fine. But this oxidation thing can happen a lot. And also you mentioned how long does it take to oxidize pellets? That episode with Simon Wittick, we talked a lot about whole cone versus pellets as well, and there were differences between the whole cones and the pellets. The pellets are crushed up, so the lupulin and oils and all this stuff are actually a lot more exposed to air than the whole cones are. Because it's still, it's not crushed up; it's still in its whole leafy, leafy natural state, I guess is the way to say it. So there's that research, but then there's also not a whole lot of research about how hop aroma and things like hop burn change over time. So there's a lot of stuff that's shown that alpha acids degrade with oxidation and with storage, but there's not a lot that looks at how aroma changes. So I think there's some studies that are going to be coming out in the next few years looking at that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And it'll be really interesting to pay attention to this in the future. But again, for me, best practice, open the bag for as little time as possible and put it back in the freezer quickly. And as long as you're doing that, I think you're going to be relatively okay. Don't treat your hops like garbage, and hopefully they'll treat you they'll treat you well too.
That's key, is The answer is simply, I don't know how long it takes. I will say that the only time I've ever experienced hop burn in my mouth is with hazy IPAs, and it's only been a few times. And my understanding is that comes from just massive dry hopping and then whatever else holds that stuff in suspension in hazy IPA. I've never experienced it in highly hopped, clear IPA or other styles for that matter. So I don't know about the whole hop burn and hop oxidation issue there. What I will say is that you always want to treat your hops well. Like you said, Cade, I agree with you. Treat them well regardless of not knowing how long they can be out without oxidizing. If you ever go to a hop farm during harvest, you are going to see that the way that they do it is they cut down the bines, they take them to a plant. This whole process takes a few hours. They're still fresh, they're still wet, technically. They put them on a drying thing, a big old drying bed, which was really fun to look at. They're huge. And then they sit there, they kind of slowly roll, on this drying bed, and then they go on for further processing. They get baled, they get put in a freezer. Are they oxidizing during that step? I mean, arguably, yeah, but they're still great. They're the hops that we love. So I don't think you have to worry about like pulling a hop bag out of the freezer, and the 15 minutes or so that it takes to weigh them all out, and you got them, they're sitting on your workbench. You're probably going to be fine with that. You just want to do everything you can to ensure their longevity. So you do want to suck the oxygen out, put them back in the freezer, store them cold. I don't even use the seal bags anymore. I keep them in the YVH Mylar bags and throw them in the freezer, and I've not had any issues whatsoever. If I didn't have freezer space, you better believe that I'm going to suck all the oxygen out of those bags, because it's that interplay that's so important. So
yeah. And one other comment on hop burn too. This actually I just remembered this, and I'm glad I was able to figure this out. Jeff Daly and I were talking about hop burn. So Jeff Daly's the sensory scientist, sensory program manager at John I. Haas. And we were talking about hop burn months ago, and he actually sent me an email about it, and he said, I think this is a direct quote from Jeff. It says, I think one of the points of disinformation that's common is that hop burn basically occurs anytime you dry hop above 3 pounds per barrel. This simply isn't true. We've brewed heavily dry hopped beers here, and with hopping over 3 pounds, and it's ubiquitous, and creates good beers.
Yeah.
The point is that this is a multivariate problem.
Yeah.
And I think that's Jeff's quote, and then this is me talking now. It's totally multivariate, right? There's so many things that go into it. It's hard to say it's just one thing. But like you, Marshall, the times that I've experienced hop burn have been in just those hazy IPAs that it tastes like there's a pellet at the bottom of the beer.
Yeah.
like a whole pellet made it into the can. And that's where I taste hop burn. But I did want to add that from Jeff, basically saying this is a multivariate problem. It's not just one thing. It could be a bunch of different issues.
Absolutely. Hopefully that suffices, David. We do have to get to a short break right now. We're going to be right back with more Brü A after these messages. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brulosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. All right, time to answer more listener-submitted questions. Go ahead and kick this round off for us, Cade.
All right, this one's from Christian Forestel. I hope I said that right. From Yokohama, Japan. He has two questions, so we'll tackle question number one first. He says, as a software entrepreneur, I work closely with AI products. Oh, I know where this is going. And I'm wondering if you've had a chance to play around with ChatGPT, the AI chatbot that's been taking the world by storm. I recently asked ChatGPT to create a hop blend that would mimic Citra based on Citra's sensory characteristics. And its response was to create a blend using 40 to 50% Mosaic, 20 to 30% Amarillo, 10 to 20% Simcoe, 10 to 15% Nelson Sauvin, and 5 to 10% Galaxy. What are your thoughts on this blend from a sensory perspective? ChatGPT isn't talented enough yet to make suggestions based on a chemical analysis perspective, though I'm sure the next iteration will be able to dig a little deeper.
I have absolutely played around with the Chat GPT. And in fact, I have a funny little story. I haven't gone public with it yet. But, well, first off, we did do an episode of the Brewlosophy show where Martin actually brewed a beer that Chat GPT designed. And that was a lot of fun. But I was introduced to Chat GPT probably 2 or 3 months ago. And I just keep it open on my phone for when I get bored. I can go in there and ask it funny questions or whatever. Well, I was telling my twin brother about it. We live the entire country apart, basically. He's in New York. I'm over here in California. And so he phoned me as I was driving home from work one day, and I'm telling him about this Chat GPT thing. I was like, dude, it's so funny. You can like have it write poems for you. And he's like, what? I was like, no, check this out. And I go and I said, I had put, write a sweet poem for my twin brother. And so it spits out this poem, and I text it to my brother, and he starts cracking up. And I was like, dude, I'm going to post this to Facebook, and people are going to think that I just wrote this poem for my brother, whatever. And I did that. And I actually felt bad. It's still on my private Facebook page. People thought that I wrote this poem for my brother. That's how real these things are. It's pretty wild. So then he went and had it write a poem for me and posted it as a comment on there, and people were none the wiser. They honestly thought we were writing poems to each other. So for those of you who saw that poem and thought I was just being really sweet with my brother, I love him. He's my best friend. I did not write that poem. It was the AI chatbot. Back to the whole hop thing. I don't think that would taste like Citra. Mosaic, Amarillo, Simcoe, Nelson, and Galaxy would taste like a muddled mess, in my opinion. That is a lot of different hops that are known for being fairly pungent and having their own unique characteristics. To mix them all together in that capacity, I don't think you're going to mimic Citra at all. That's just my opinion. I haven't done it. I think it would be absolutely fascinating to give it a go, and to do even more some experiments using ChatGPT to kind of come up with our variables like this would be really fascinating. My point though is if hops, the price of hops has come down, and I'm really happy for that. I think in part because people aren't buying as many hops these days. We're in a bit of a lull. We've talked about that, whatever. But if you're going to go out and spend all the money on Mosaic, Amarillo, Simcoe, Nelson Sauvin, which is not a cheap hop, and Galaxy, use those for how you want to use them. Citra is cheaper than all of those, I think. So I would just go buy some Citra. But that's my more pragmatic response to that question.
Well, I was thinking about this. So Will was just, sending an experiment idea yesterday or this week, and he was looking for English hops, and he didn't have any English hops in his freezer. And so I was thinking about this and going like, maybe that's a way we could use ChatGPT. It's like, crap, I need to brew an English beer this weekend, but I don't have any Fuggles or EKG. So, here's the hops that I have. Make me a blend that tastes like an English hop with this. That could be kind of cool.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing is we need to start a ChatGPT experiment series.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Like we need. Well, I think we still have 2 days a week that we don't have content, right? Saturday and Sunday. So I think. No,
Stop
kidding.
it.
I'm kidding, but no. But really, this is another big plug. Speaking of the content, that episode with Martin on the Brewlosophy show where he asked ChatGPT to create that English, was it a golden blonde or something like that? I can't remember the style.
British golden ale, something like that. Yeah.
That was a fantastic episode. I loved that. I thought that was hilarious, and brewed the beer and then actually served it to people and got their opinions on it. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah. And I forgot to say, that's an interesting idea with the hot blend, but I'm in Marshall's boat too. I'm like, that's a really expensive Citra.
Yeah, no joke.
Blend all that.
But I get the idea. It is fun, right? You're like, okay, let's just see what I can do, So I totally get it, Christian. Give it a go. I mean, if you can get your hand over in Yokohama, if you can get your hands on Mosaic, Amarillo, Simcoe, Nelson, and Galaxy to mimic Citra, give it a go and let us know how it turns out.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, Christian also asked a really fun question as his second one. He says, what's your go-to lead-off karaoke song?
Yes.
I typically pick something a little brusque, like Song 2 by Blur or Rockin' Like Last Night by The Strokes.
Yeah, I love when people ask us non-brewing related questions. It allows
Me too.
Yeah, because there's like 4 things in life that I absolutely love: my wife, my kids, beer, and karaoke. So my go-to songs are a little bit weird. I kind of got into so I actually do sing. I'm not saying I'm good, but I write songs, I sing, I do stuff like that. And so, God, probably 6 or 7 years ago, we were doing some karaoke over at Jersey's house when he lived in the neighborhood. He no longer does, of course. And somebody put on Tennessee Whiskey, the Chris Stapleton version of it. And so I started doing that one, and it became like my leading, like you said, Christian, my lead off karaoke song. Whenever we'd go out to karaoke bars, I would do it. It's just kind of a thing that I do now. But really the one that we always do, and this is only when Jersey and I are doing karaoke together, we both grew up absolutely in love with the band Chicago, which is kind of weird that these two 40-something, kids, when we were kids, were like sitting in our room listening to love songs that were written by Chicago. But it's something that we had in common. And so he and I always do Hard to Say I'm Sorry together. And we switch back and forth with who harmonizes with the other one, stuff like that. And then the other one that I love doing, because I'm a huge Lionel Richie fan, is Sail On by Lionel Richie. So those are my 3 go-tos. Almost every time I do karaoke, I won't do Hard to Say I'm Sorry without Jersey. That's a kind of a special thing for the two of us. But I will almost always do Tennessee Whiskey and Sail On by Lionel Richie. Do you even do karaoke, Cade?
I do karaoke, but nowhere near as often as you do. I'm usually, honestly, too, more of a lurker and not a singer. I don't really have a leadoff song. I usually let my wife does it. My wife actually is usually the one that does the leadoffs for us, and she's awesome. She either does Metallica, like Whiskey in a Jar, or she knows every single word cold to Coolio's Gangsta's Paradise. And so those are 2 that she'll lead off. And after that, I just can't follow that up, right? I'm just like, well, okay, there we go.
The thought of your wife doing Gangster's Paradise.
Yeah, I know. It's so, dude, I'm telling you though, like at the bar, like you get up there at the bar and she goes up and does Gangsta's Paradise and the whole place just goes nuts. I mean,
so
they love it. The only thing I'll say, and this is totally cliche, but hey, that's who I am. At some point during the night, Friends in Low Places is going to get sung, right?
Yeah.
It's just going to happen. I can't let a night go by without doing Garth Brooks. So that's going to happen at least once.
That's like Sweet Caroline. Somebody's always going to do it,
Right,
So,
exactly.
Well, I love karaoke. I'm glad you do too, Christian. And I actually like both of those songs as karaoke songs that you do. The Strokes and Blur. Those would be a lot of fun. So next question comes from Rob Roy, who says, normally I don't concern myself too much with clarity as I am the main consumer of my beer. With enough patience, my beers usually drop fairly bright anyway. And when I really want to boost that clarity faster, I gelatin fine in the keg. Well, I decided I was going to bottle for competition. So I gelatin fined the 4 kegs of beer I had: Pilsner, Märzen, Doppelbock, and American Light Lager. I like your style, Rob. All of these beers were fermented with WLP 860 Munich Helles yeast. I believe that's the Augustiner strain. But the American Light Lager didn't drop bright. In fact, it's more than a little hazy. It's one of the 4 that was most recently brewed, but it's still a month since I brewed it. That's usually not a problem with gelatin in my experience. What could be the reason for this haze? My only thought is that when I made the gelatin and then split it into 4 portions, it possibly didn't homogenize well enough, and little to no gelatin got into that keg. For additional reference, the recipe was just American 2-row and dextrose. It's not the end of the world since appearance is just 3 points, and it tastes like those crispy Miller Lights we love, but I'm more curious for my own process.
Yeah, so at the top of the show, I mentioned that there were some questions in here that really threw me for a loop. And this is one, and it's because I'm currently struggling with this too. And I don't know what the answer is. I haven't figured it out for myself. I'll tell you where I'm thinking I'm at right now, but there's so many different things that I just haven't had a chance to play around with. Like, for example, I have an American Light Lager right now that I just brewed that didn't drop clear, and I don't know why. One of the questions I had with yours, since you've got a Pilsner, a Märzen, a Doppelbock, and an American Light Lager, I'm guessing that the malt bills are different in those, right? I mean, clearly with the Märzen and Doppelbock, that's going to be different than the light lager. And I'm wondering, what's your base malt? Is it all a different base malt, or are they all the same base malt? That could have something to do with it. I've kind of got this pet theory. Again, this is just me. This is my pet theory that there's maybe more protein in malts now than there were a few years ago, and that might be leading to hazes at the homebrew level. And I'm wondering if that's actually true, or if that's just totally me. I've tried the same thing where I've done gelatin and it hasn't dropped clear. Now, a note on gelatin. Gelatin is charged. I think it's positively charged. I can't remember. But there are positively and negatively charged hazes. So gelatin won't get everything. It's going to get most, and that's why beer usually drops really nicely clear. But it's not going to get everything. And there are a lot of different yeasts that have an impact on haze. And so I'm wondering if maybe the yeast is doing it, or if it's just some, we just reached some point, like threshold point, where like the protein level is just high enough and the yeast is contributing just enough of whatever the yeast is contributing to cause the haze, or there's just enough hops in there that it's just pushing it just over the line and that we're getting all of this haze. I don't know if that's actually true or if that's based on any science, but that's kind of my feeling. And then one other comment, this is the last comment that I've had too. I don't know if you're fining in the keg, but that's something that I do frequently, is fine in the keg.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to me the number of times, how many times I've like poured pint, and it's just hazy. And I'm thinking, well, damn, I guess it just didn't clear up. And then like overnight, I get through the sediment layer and suddenly it's beautifully bright and clear. And it happens like between pints, like one pint is hazy and the next pint is just totally brilliant.
Yeah.
And clear. So I don't know if you're fining in the keg, but that is something that I've at least been able to rule out in some of the beers, is when I find in keg, it sometimes takes a long time to get through the sediment.
So he said he did find these in the keg. That was my first thought as well. Is we've all had this thing where you're like, oh man, I should be through the sediment layer by now, and you're just not. You can get these floating dip tube things. I hate using those things, but they do work really well so that you're getting the clearest beer first, when you're serving. But I have a feeling that Rob knows what he's doing. It sounds like he's done this many times, and the struggle really is that this American Light Lager just isn't dropping clear. So on that line, I've had the same experience, and it's almost always with like single malt pale lagers, where I'm like, why is this not dropping clear with gelatin? I don't know why. I'm with you, Cade. I really don't get it. To me, I always presume it's a protein haze issue, and that, with a long time of lagering, it will eventually drop out. But most people don't want to wait that long to start drinking their beer. So what I've found is that different fining agents, they all work differently. We know that. So gelatin does one thing, Biofine does another thing, and Clarity Firm does something else. When one of those three doesn't work for me, I always start with gelatin. I might try something else, and the only time I've ever had luck just getting one of these, I've made some very clear American lagers, don't get me wrong, but when I had one that just would not seem to clear up, and I hit it with gelatin, it was still hazy. I put some Biofine in the keg, and it dropped clear in like 12 hours. So it did something different that really did seem to work in a way that gelatin wasn't. So you might want to try that, but I don't know the answer. If you're making beers that taste as good as Miller Lite, who cares what they look like, I guess. But I get it. I love clear beer, and so I'd be trying to workshop it as well, try to figure out what I could do to make these beers more clear. So
I was just going to say that same thing. I mean, that sounds exactly like what my thoughts are on this, Marshall. It's just, I'm not sure. This is something I've certainly been struggling with. So if you figure it out, then let me know, because I want to try it in my own brewing. And all right, so next question comes from Jimmy from Auckland, New Zealand. And he says, I'm having a bit of fun by essentially brewing a sour beer using a hazy IPA malt bill, vanilla lactose, and dextrose. It's okay, it's just for fun. The yeast will be Philly sour, and I'm aiming for around 7% ABV with less than 30 IBU using Eldorado and Zappa hops. I've decided I want to add fruit tea. So fruit tea, yeah, I said that right. I'm thinking either tropical berry or a combo. I'm leaning towards around 150 grams, 5.3 ounces in a 23-liter, 6-gallon batch, and throwing it in with the dry hop. Should I leave them in the bag, put the loose leaf tea in, or is there a better method?
Listen, I've never brewed with tea. Now I know that he's not talking about like black tea. He's talking about these really tasty fruited teas. They might have hibiscus or whatever dried fruits are in these teas. And I think that's a great idea for imparting a really complex fruit character to beer. I would absolutely bag it. I would leave them in the bag because if you don't, chances are they're going to get they're going to clog your dip tube or whatever it is that you're fermenting in. If you're using a siphon, that stuff can clog and it just creates a mess. If you put it in a bag, you drop that in your beer and you leave it in there for however long, then you can also remove it if you want to. If you feel like the fruit tea character is getting too strong, you can take the bag out easily. And then when you're transferring out of that fermenter or whatever it is that you've got the beer being teed in, if you will, again, you're not going to clog any of those tubes. I would leave it in a bag.
Yeah, I mean, I've brewed with loose leaf tea before. I mean, I've talked a couple of times on the show about how at Brü A we have this beer, or they had this beer called Cool in the Gang, and that was like 80 pounds of tea leaves that get dumped into a fermenter, and it was all loose leaf. And yes, it was a pain in the butt to get out of the fermenter, but it created a fantastic beer. And I mean, Cool in the Gang is one of the top selling beers from Brü A with that loose leaf tea, and that was one of the reasons. So Jeff did a whole bunch of experiments. He put tea in bags, he put tea in loose leaf. Tried to like run it through a brink system, which is basically like, just running the beer over the tea bags, like, like an extraction or something like you'd brew normally.
Yeah.
Like recirculating over the tea that's in like a tank. He tried all these different methods and he came up with the loose leaf. And to him, that was what gave it the best tea character in that beer. So that's how he does it. I've never brewed with it myself at home, but I do think I remember Steve or one of the crew members talking about keg hopping or like tea, keeping tea in the keg as well. And I would think if in that case, yeah, totally. I would not want loose leaf tea anywhere near my keg in my dip tube or
exactly.
my quick disconnects or anything. That's going to be miserable. So if you're doing it in the fermenter, maybe loose leaf, but otherwise, no. If you're in the keg, bag. And also, not to dissuade, but sour hazy IPA with vanilla lactose, 7% ABV, Eldorado Zappa hops, and you want to add fruit tea to it.
What the hell?
Like, I know it's fun. But that's a lot. But you do you. If it turns out great, then that's fantastic. And again, not to dissuade you, but that sounds like a lot.
Well, that was going to be my final comment for Jimmy was I love it. I would never drink that beer or brew it. At least I would definitely taste it. But I love that you're doing what you're supposed to do with a hobby, which is having fun, experimenting, doing cool things. That is what's so rad about being able to brew your own beer and throw out whatever you want to. So next question comes from Sean Clark, who's from Canada. Sean says, I read a lot of books and watch a lot of YouTube videos, and I feel like I have a fairly good understanding of the brewing process. Mash temp, water chemistry, yeast starters, fermentation temp control, etc. I have all of this in place, and I sanitize like a son of a gun. But my last two batches were very cloudy. Ooh boy, another haze question. Not like a chill haze, but actually cloudy. I tried fining with gelatin, but it did nothing. I'm curious to know what you think might be causing this. It doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good either. I don't know if it's a hot side or cold side issue, but after two batches in a row, I'm getting a little discouraged. I'm going to try BIAB or brew in a bag for the first time soon, as maybe my lauter is poor and I'm getting a lot of crud. I don't know. This does seem slightly different of a question than the last one about the American Light Lager that wouldn't clear up, because he's actually getting what sounds to be a very cloudy, almost murky sounding beer, despite doing all of the right stuff. So I'm curious what you think this might be, Cade.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I wonder about crud, because you also said that it doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good, right? And I think the prior comment was saying, hey, there's no flavor differences here. This is just a haze. And that's more similar to what I've been having. It's like no flavor differences in the beer. They still taste just fine, but they're just not dropping clear. So that was sort of the prior comment. I'm going to answer this one from a little bit different, perspective again, because it is possible you could be getting crud in your beer. And one thing I would ask of you, Sean, is how long are you letting these batches sit, right? Are they ever dropping clear? Because one thing I've noticed is if I let them set for a really long time, or they just happen to be sitting in the back of my refrigerator for a while, then eventually it does drop clear. It just takes it a really long time to do that, even in the presence of gelatin. And like Marshall said, there are other fining agents that you can use, like biofine or something, but lots of things contribute to haze. It could be some malt issues, right? There could be some crush on your malt that's not you may check your mill and your crush size. BIAB, I'm not sure if that's going to make it less hazy. That might actually make it more hazy, depending on your lautering methods and how finely you crush your grain. But also consider doing like a protein rest, or maybe picking a different yeast. I mean, any of those things could impact this haze that you're having. And then the last thing I'll say too, and maybe you should have said this at the prior comment as well, is that gelatin isn't a panacea.
That's right.
Right? It's not like you add gelatin and the beer drops clear every time. There are different fining agents and a lot of different things that play into haze.
That's a very good point, that gelatin is not the cure-all. It's not. It won't always fix haze, as we've seen here with Sean and that American Light Lager. Everything you said is exactly what I was thinking. There's only one other thing that comes to mind, and Sean mentions that he mines his water chemistry, which is awesome. I think what he didn't mention where he's getting his water. If you've got really hard water, it can have all kinds of bad impacts on your beer. It can make the beer taste bad, not good or whatever, but not like undrinkable. But you're like, there's something off with this beer. It can cause haze. It can have all kinds of stuff. So what I would do is, if you are using tap water, go to the store, spend $10 on, some RO water or whatever spring water that is good, build it up to your preferred profile, and then try brewing a batch doing that. That would be the very first thing I would do. If you're still getting really hazy beer and you've swapped out your yeast, you're minding all of these other process variables, then I don't know. I keep saying it. I would think that maybe there is a spoilage bacteria or something in a part of your cold side process that's going to work after you create your wort and pitch your yeast, because that can create a hazy beer as well. And until it really takes hold, you're going to see the impact of it before you really taste it, but it's still going to create that beer where you're like, it's just not right. It's not as good as it could be. And I've had that experience before. We intentionally do these things for our experimentation. But that would be the first two things that I would do is swap out your water, see how that does, and make sure that your cold side equipment is clean and sanitized before you pitch your yeast. So,
yeah. And then last thing I'd say is maybe try filtration too. And that also applies to the prior comment as well. If you've got it and you're interested in doing it, see if you can get some filtration equipment and see if that helps with your haze as well too. So that's always an option. All right. I think this is the final comment.
Final question. Yep.
All right. I'm going to say this one. I'm going to totally butcher this one name. Butcher your name. I think it's Renault Plante, or something like that. I apologize. From Montreal, Quebec, Canada. I don't speak French, so I'm sure I totally butchered your name, but I apologize. He says, I've been homebrewing for about 3 years and started with all grain right away by using recipes I found in books, magazines, and different websites. I've always made a point of keeping the names of the beers and referencing the source of the recipes as the author in Brewfather, on labels I make for the bottles, and on my tap list. Intellectual property is something I deeply respect. When somebody puts in the time, effort, and creativity to build a recipe and share it, I believe the least I can do is to give them credit when I brew it. That being said, I've lately been trying to come up with my own recipes from scratch or tweaking existing recipes. If I only substitute a hop for a close cousin because of my inventory, I'm still, in my opinion, using someone else's recipe. But if I change something like Nelson Sauvin, which I'm not fond of, for a completely different variety on purpose with the intent of changing the recipe, then I'm creating something new. If I'm using the exact grain bill but change a few hops and the yeast, I'm creating a completely different beer. When does a recipe I tweak become my recipe and not someone else's? Keeping the previous author as a reference is something respectful to me, but at the same time, even the slightest change in the recipe might change the beer and doesn't represent what the original author wanted in the first place. I might be nerding out on this, but this is a real struggle for me.
Nerding out, you sound like a home brewer. That's what we do.
Yeah, right?
I know that my perspective on this is probably a little less conventional. It doesn't really jibe with what most people think. It certainly doesn't with what Renaud thinks about it. If you take, probably my most popular recipe out there right now is Tiny Bottom Pale Ale. It's kind of something Brülosophy is known for. If you take that recipe and brew it exactly as I wrote it, and you called it something else, no sweat. Couldn't care less. It's your beer now because you brewed it. And we have a great article. I really like this article called A Brewer's Thumbprint. Your brewing is what makes that beer your own. Recipes are not that hard to come up with, in my opinion. I've got great friends who are professional brewers who refuse to share, their popular IPA recipes and stuff like that because of intellectual property. They don't want other people copying it. I don't see the point. Vinny sharing Pliny the Elder should be point enough that it doesn't matter if other people have your recipe. Now, if another brewery takes that Pliny the Elder recipe and starts making their own, double IPA that tastes exactly like Pliny, I doubt it will, and starts marketing it as something else, then yeah, okay, I see that there's a minor issue there. But really, in the end, you're brewing that beer, which makes it your own. Call it something else if you want to. It doesn't bother me. When I brew Tiny Bottom Pale Ale, I call it Tiny Bottom Pale Ale so people know what to expect when they drink it, not because of some sense of pride or anything like that. So my opinion, which again, I understand is probably not very popular, is that if you brew it, it is yours. Call it what you want. Don't worry too much about it. I do think it's very noble of you to have so much respect that you want to hey, I got this off of such and such a website or out of this magazine. It's not my recipe. Very cool of you to do that. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's disrespectful to make a minor tweak and call it your own. I think that's what a lot of people are doing, even on the commercial scale. They're going with beers that maybe they heard about a recipe or they found something, in a magazine or whatever. They make a tiny little tweak and they call it their own. I think that's kind of the norm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't think. I guess two interesting comments. One, I thought I was going to have a different opinion too, right? But Marshall, apparently you and I share very similar opinions. I thought most people were going to be much more like Renaud, and want to like adequately attribute, where they're getting their recipes from.
Yeah.
But my opinion is sort of, maybe this is because of my background as a lawyer. It's more influenced by just, this is the way it is in the United States. So in the United States, a recipe is just a factual list of ingredients and steps.
Yeah.
It's not considered a creative expression according to U.S. copyright law. And this makes it sounds like, wait, what? But brewing is creative process. What are you talking about? It's just a factual list of ingredients and steps. Somebody had to create that and come up with it and brew it and make sure that it tasted good. But the key here is the recipe isn't what you pay for at the brewery or at the restaurant. You're not going there and buying the recipe so that you can come home and cook it. It's the talent of the person that's cooking it or brewing it, right? It's that preparation. It's that nuance. It's their system, that they're brewing on, right? I mean, the recipe between Freem Pils and Augustiner and, what's another great one? Wayfinder Pils, what are any of these amazing Pilsner beers that you've had internationally? The recipe's probably not all that different. Right?
I'd reckon that they're almost identical,
Right. But they're very different beers. Well, maybe they're not. I've never had them all side by side, so I don't really know. But it's the preparation. It's the brewer.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
That's the key difference. And I'm certainly not ever going to I'll give you an example, right? I used to brew a lot from Jamil Zainashev's Brewing Classic Styles.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic book and a fantastic collection of recipes. It's a gold-winning recipe for every single style in the BJCP, or at least every single style when that book was published. And it's fantastic. I've brewed some of the recipes. I mean, literally just pulled that recipe out of the book and brewed the beer, and I can say that they're fantastic. That's how I started brewing, and that's how I started doing recipe tweaks was, okay, take the Brewing Classic style recipe, tweak the ingredients that I have on hand, and also tweak how I want it to taste. Because again, even though those are how, Jamil made gold medal winning beers, it's how Jamil wanted those gold medal winning beers to taste. Yeah. I might want it to taste a little bit differently. If I brew a recipe straight, like for example, straight out of Brewing Classic Styles, then I'm certainly going to credit Jamil as the author of the recipe. Or I'm going to say like, hey, this is Brewing Classic Styles, Doppelbock. And that's going to be like the title of my recipe. I'm not going to call it some interesting name. I'm just going to say this is Jamil Zainashev's Doppelbock recipe. And this is my version of it, how I brewed it. But again, that's kind of how I think about like recipes. Once I've tweaked it, I'm not going to say it's my recipe because I don't really feel like ownership of recipes. But once I've tweaked it, it's no longer that person's recipe, right? I mean, it's like Coke and Pepsi, right? They're different, they're similar, but like they're not the same, And so they're two iterations of the same cola product. And another great example here, I have a fantastic one. This is very recent. Is I was just at a homebrew club meeting with the Corvallis Homebrew Club, and one of the brewers there, John Price, he's actually the president of the club, brewed a beer which had Omega Yeast's Lunar Crush. Uh-huh. So that's their GMO thiolized strain that releases thiols. And he also had used S23, which is Fermentus's just straight German lager strain. They did a 10-gallon batch of German Pils wort, and maybe it had a light dry hop or something in it, but a 10-gallon batch, split it into two 5-gallon fermenters, and the only difference was Lunar Crush and S23, right? Those beers were wildly different. The only change was the yeast. If you looked at the recipe online, it would say exactly the same thing. The water profile, the equipment, everything, but the yeast was different, and those are wildly different beers. That's just one ingredient. Actually, as an aside too, they did a third beer too with a totally different grain bill and hops. They used rye and adjuncts and Nelson Sauvin and a whole bunch of different hops and brewed it with Lunar Crush. And actually, the two Lunar Crush beers tasted more similar than the S23 beer, even though they were totally different recipes. But that's totally an aside. And so that's kind of how I think of like this whole copyright of a recipe. I mean, again, for me, a recipe is just, like I said earlier, a factual list of ingredients and steps. You, the brewer, are the one that's adding your creative expression when you use that recipe. Certainly attribute someone if you're copying the recipe straight and just brewing that beer, because I just think that's the right thing to do. But if you're making tweaks to it, especially if you're changing hops or yeast or anything. Oh, and one other thing, sorry, I'm just rambling forever on this question. But one other thing, too, is most of these online recipes, including Brewing Classic Styles, are incomplete. They don't include base water chemistry or the equipment profile, right? Most recipes don't say, here's my water chemistry. We put it on our experiments because we think it's important. But most recipes don't say, I had 20 parts per million calcium and, 25 parts per million sulfate. They're just saying, like, add a teaspoon of gypsum, right? To whatever water you're using. So just changing, brewing it at your house with your water is going to change the recipe. I think that's my last comment. I'll stop there because it sounds like I'm rambling along. But I guess I nerded out a little bit on this too, which we expected. But those are sort of my opinions. If you're changing the recipe in any way, it's no longer the other person's recipe. You've made changes to it. I'm not going to say it's my recipe at that point. I'm not going to claim ownership of the recipe because I just don't feel that way about recipes. It's just what I did in this batch. I just changed this and now I brew this way. And when somebody like Vinny Cilurzo releases the recipe for Pliny the Elder, I think that's also like somebody that's highly respected in the industry, the number one tasting beer in America for like the last 20 or 15 years, is doing this. That's kind of, I think I have similar opinions as he does.
Look, if you take one of my recipes and you brew it exactly as I have it written and you call it something else, Own it. I don't care. It's all you. Like you said, ownership of a recipe is not something I pride myself on. And I've had experiences where a buddy of mine, Wes, made Tiny Bottom Pale Ale exactly as it's written, brought it over to my place. We drank it side by side with one that I made. They tasted different. So that's my thing is you can brew a recipe, but your touch, your thumbprint is what's going to make it unique, and your own. And so if you want to call it something else, not give credit, I don't think that's an issue, but hey, I think it's noble of you to do that. So, well, that is all we've got for our 280th episode. Thanks again to everybody who submitted questions. I know I had a good time answering them. How about you, Cade?
Oh, always. I love listener questions. So keep them coming, and we'll do it again in another 10 episodes.
Absolutely. If there's anything at all you'd like for us to address in a future Brü A episode, all you have to do is send your question to feedback@brülosophy.com and make sure to indicate it's for Brü A in the subject line, so I'm sure to add it to the list. Don't forget to check out the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with brewing professionals to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And make sure to head over to brülosophy.com to read up on all of the fun beer and brewing stuff we're up to. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.